Now, Partha, then Marcelo, and then Steve. Please, Partha.
Thank you. That was absolutely stunning. You were mentioning interim conclusions, interim findings, and I wonder whether, let me just try and see how to phrase it. There will be a sense in which pretty much every cluster of villages will have to adapt the general moves towards smart villages to their local conditions and their social structure. A village in Kerala looks very different from village in, we all know that, okay. Now, every village that I know of has some form of collective being, so to speak. Some are very male-dominated. The Grama Panchayats, for example, used to be very male-dominated. Not so in the south that much. Do you have any, and then in Bangladesh, for example, there's a very activist rural population. One reason why the NGOs are extremely active there, it's hard to know what the causal chain is, but the fact is that UNIS and others were very successful, at least in their enterprises, precisely because there was an active group of women. Do you have any sense from the limited experience that you have had so far with smart villages, it's a new initiative, as to what kind of buttons to press to energize, because it will be the villagers who will have to carry the can at the end of the day. You're supplying capital, knowledge, and so forth, but they will have to adapt in their existing social structure, some modifications, and so forth. And there are power relationship problems within villages too. Do you have any is there something systematic study of what works, what doesn't, what kind of buttons are? I'm sorry, I can't be more precise than that, but I'm sort of vaguely trying to see the dialogue between the activists who are coming in from the outside, absolutely necessary, but the response from inside. People we heard in that video, of course, they looked entrepreneurial, it was terrific, but the underlying dynamics of the villages, do you have any sense yet of what works and what doesn't?
Thank you. Please.
Let me re-emphasize that we have constructed in such a way that we have been looking at the comparators across a wide range, and that was quite deliberate. Rather than taking one specific example, we've been looking for the differences and the commonalities. Also, in the individual workshops, we have always deliberately tried to draw together a range of people from village chiefs right up to policymakers and all the people in between, and particularly from the NGOs who've often got a particular contribution to make. I think the surprise has been that many of these villages have no perspective at all about renewable energy of the type that we're discussing. And I think this is where this question of awareness raising becomes particularly important. And so our experience has been that instead of going into villages and introducing what we think will be the solutions for the villagers, we're much more interested in getting them to think about what are the productive enterprises that could develop within the village from introducing something like a solar panel or a microgrid or linking with a cluster of villages in order to do that. I think that we find has been particularly important because there have been examples in the past, as you well know, where organizations have put in extremely large sums of money into villages, and it's been very much a top-down exercise. So I think that by taking the position that we want to learn what is happening in the villages and what are the barriers and what are preventing them from developing many of these activities, we are actually, hopefully, encouraging them to think about what are the productive enterprises that could then lead on to other things. And the purpose of that, of course, is to look at ways in which one could develop something that is sustainable, that is going to be replicable, and also that is going to be eventually scalable, so that it could so that it could be expanded to other villages as well.
Thank you. Marcelo.
Thank you very much. It was a really very interesting paper. I have two questions. One about this village smart, and is this. We have other meetings here, and some people of the, I think was Harvard University, have some experience that in this kind of village, but in Africa, with this system of electricity, education. What about education in this village, smart village? Because really, we can have all the more modern instruments with this kind of electricity. And for some people in these meetings, they say that this system of education is better than the traditional system. And the young people learn very, very fast than with our traditional system. I don't know if it's true. But what about education in this village? This is one. The second question is, some people say that in the cities in Germany, for example, there are some kind of discongestion. That is to say, people prefer to live near to the city in the towns, in the old towns that today become towns that the people live when there are good communication with the big city. I don't know if in England something like this you have.
Thank you.
Just first of all, on your last point, I was quite struck by the preceding paper because there is this whole question of what is happening in the peri-urban region of cities. And we have a considerable interest these days in the extent to which there could well be a very important interaction between a smart city and a smart village, in that the smart villages, if they are actually going to be the centers where there is agricultural productivity and food supply, that smart cities are going to be dependent on this interaction. So the issue of the peri-urban activity is one of interest to us. One of the really negative parts has to do with planning, because there have been numerous cases, sadly, where villagers have started to develop their own renewable energy systems, and then suddenly the grid arrives. And that, of course, undercuts completely the whole strategy. So there's a very important area of strategic thinking and planning between city authorities and rural authorities in terms of how you integrate, where organizations have plans to extend unexpectedly, because suddenly there's a large donation from some organization that then makes it much more feasible to have grid extension. Now, on the question of innovation, we have been running in parallel some competitions in East Africa, West Africa, and India to try to identify young people who got got some bright ideas in connection with the development of smart villages. And from that, we've actually identified quite a number with a group of students from the University of Cambridge, which has also stimulated activity in universities in East Africa and also in India, from which a number of interesting ideas have developed. So this again is an attempt on our part to try to draw out and encourage local people and local students to develop their own innovations. One of the most striking for me was in Pakistan, excuse me, where the Aga Khan University gave us the opportunity to develop a competition with school children in Pakistan. And we asked the school children to prepare posters with the title, "What is a Smart Village?" And this was up in the northwest corner of Pakistan towards Gilgit, quite a remote area, where, remarkably, literacy is 95%. What was astonishing from the submissions, of which there were 1,500, 70% of these were girls. We gave the top prize to a young man, and as happens these days, unfortunately, the prize was that he should come to Cambridge and spend a week in Cambridge with his mother, but unfortunately the visa failed, so we gave him a laptop instead, but that's by the way. But what struck me particularly about these submissions, it brought tears to your eyes to read what these young people had suddenly discovered, that if they could get renewable energy into their villages, it would have a transformative effect in their village. And they had worked it out on the web, they discussed it, they had put together some really fascinating submissions. So
Yeah.
that's my response to your question about innovation.
Thank you. Stuart.
I wanted to elaborate on your story about charcoal and what I'm going to call rocket stoves, because that's what we call them in my group. And to make a point about focusing on biodiversity, in this case focusing on Madagascar. Now, when I travel around East Africa, I see little boys guarding bags of charcoal everywhere. So there are clearly people in the business of charcoal who I understand that would not want to be put out of work. But Madagascar is substantially poorer. And so while there are charcoal burners there, most people gather the fuel themselves. And we have found it to be extraordinarily cost-effective to go around with our bags of cement and a rocket stove mold and buy and build rocket stoves for people. They cost a few dollars a piece. So I think there are places where people are so poor that you're not going to put the charcoal burners out of business because people can't afford to buy the charcoal. And Madagascar was once described as the worst country in the world to be a tree, and therefore going to the outskirts of national parks, as we are doing, and simply getting our undergraduates to build rocket stoves as being effective. I also want to make yet another plug for bottom-up, because my least favorite conservation organization in the world installed a $2 million solar panel scheme in this village, but never found a way to turn it on. So getting people locally to look at local solutions of smart villages, I think has enormous traction, and particularly when you're focusing on the key biodiversity areas, can be exceptionally effective.
Thank you, Stuart. Please.
On the question of solar panel maintenance, I entirely agree with your point. Excuse me. But you no doubt know about Barefoot College in India, where Bunker Roy, who no doubt Ves Bengali is familiar with, has set up a college for training people in the maintenance of solar panels and also for the installation. So his plan, which has been remarkably successful, is to identify grandmothers in villages. And I give you the example of Sierra Leone, where 2 grandmothers were identified by him personally to take to the Barefoot College in India. They'd never been out of their village before. They spend 6 months in this village. They're trained in how to install solar panels. They're trained in how to maintain them. And they go back to their village. And because they are grandmothers, they go back to their village, of course. So this is the background to it. And he's developed that idea quite substantially. So you're absolutely right. Whether it's solar irrigation or whether it's solar panels or whatever, there has to be training and education, and that has to happen in a smart village.
Please, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting array of examples.
I've got two questions. One relates to the general scale of the problem. You made the observation that there's over 600,000 villages in India alone, and this is an issue that extends well beyond India. Have you done any calculations as to what the overall resource requirements would be to electrify in different ways, either through the grid extension or through solar panels, the whole of the area that you would want to affect? And related to that, what would the serious funding options be aside from the fund that you mentioned within India? And then a second question, which is related to that. I mean, this is going to be a very significant outlay, whatever would happen, right? And you mentioned the fact that some villages have invested themselves in renewable energy sources. What is the evidence for the villages that you've investigated having a demonstration effect that encourages neighboring villages to pick up that kind of technology? And are there signals that you've been able to take out of the work you've done that would say what makes one village a better demonstrator than another village?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, our aim in this project has not been to put solar panels into villages. Our aim has been to gain knowledge of what are the barriers that are preventing the development of access to electricity in these villages, with a view to drawing together recommendations and statements that we can provide to policymakers, because this project grew out of an earlier one which involved the European academies, who were asking the question of what are the barriers to the development of rural communities, and in particularly where energy was lacking. So the project, as it's been constructed, has not addressed that question, but of course it is a critical point. And so when we were at our workshop recently in India, the very first question from the journalists, of whom, as you can imagine, in India there were very many, their first question was, will it pay? And who's going to pay for it? We have not addressed the economics of that issue at all, but I know there are beginning to be groups that are looking at it from this point of view. Ashok Das, who was the person that was shown in the video, he's one of the leading entrepreneurs in India, and he himself has not yet completed a full economic assessment of what he has achieved with his village, which he claims is the first smart village in India. I'm not entirely sure whether that is the case, but it certainly is an early example. But I think it relates to the fact that there has been very little investment in this sort of idea so far. And a part of the purpose of our project has been to raise awareness and draw attention to the idea that this might be one possible way forward in terms of energy access. It's only latterly that we've been thinking of it in terms of biodiversity, stimulated by the question that Partha asked me a few months ago.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perhaps I could just add a further point, and that is to say that we're coming towards the end of the third year, which will be completed at the end of September this year. And we are now asking the question, and other people are asking us the question, what is going to be the sun of smart villages? And it would be great if some of you thought that there is an opportunity here for us to think in terms of developing the sun of smart villages. Several people have said to us, can we have more demonstration modules? Can we have more prototypes in different parts of the world, in some of the countries where we've been collecting information? And it may be that that will be one of the ways forward. And of course it does fit exactly into Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which for the first time is devoted to energy. And it could be that there are going to be openings and possibilities there for the future that will be of interest to a number of groups. We've just been invited to go to the UN meeting in Brooklyn at the beginning of April, Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, which is a group that we've been interacting with previously, but we've now been asked to go make a presentation on the findings that we have so far from our study. So it could be that there is going to be a growing interest in this as a possibility for the future.
Thank you. The final question from Maggie, and then I think we have...
Okay. I am literally talking off the top of my head, speculatively, and it's an alternative to the demo model that's been put forward. Now, you know I don't like the term cultural capital or social capital. I really dislike it. You can't bank it, you don't get interest on it, etc., etc. But I do like the idea of social resources locally. And I had the following two thoughts that maybe there is nothing in them. One would be, instead of relying on external investment, which always comes with one kind or another strings attached, could one not make use of local networks? In other words, you gave us some figures in the middle about the increased earnings of not just individual people, but shops and the community in general. Could there not be room for a network of one village investing in its neighbour or in the neighbourhood, cutting out the middleman, cutting out the banking, cutting out the governmental regulation? And it just struck me that one good place maybe to start this would be in the Serengeti or the Masai Mara, where the Maasai villagers, well, the men at least, can run up to 100 kilometers a day. They are very conversant with the villages around them. So, you know, the demo model is, if you put one up, it's already there for local people to go and inspect and possibly use the resources of the other village as investment capital for getting off the ground, paying it back to the donor village in the first place, and everybody seems to gain on that kind of model. It's a real bottom-up cooperative model rather than a top-down interventionist model. Is there any mileage in it?
Yes, there certainly is mileage in that, and in a number of places it is already happening. So we do have examples, and the one I gave you from the Maasai village, for example, in Tanzania, that is a classical example. And he's now, we take him to various meetings that we're invited to. We're going to take him to other places in Africa where he's going to go with us to this United Nations meeting in Brooklyn. People want to hear about local developments that are being done by people on the ground. This, I think, is where Smart Villages has a particular application, because you're dealing with what we refer to in the jargon as distributed energy. That it is created on the ground in the village where people live. It doesn't depend on a cable coming from anybody else. The issue, however, is how do you get the financial support to make sure that you can make those initial steps? And that's why I've mentioned some of our preliminary findings. We do have to find a way in which we can persuade the banks and the financial people to make some initial investment in this whole idea. And this is probably going to come back to government involvement in some form or other in the initial stages, or private investors if they can be identified. But you're quite right. I mean, there's a huge amount of entrepreneurship in these countries yet to uncover. And if we can find ways in which they can be encouraged to develop these ideas with the knowledge that they gain, either from a demonstration, a prototype. I quite like the idea of a prototype because people do go to see them and they see these working in practice, and then they get ideas that these are things they may well develop elsewhere. But yes, I think your idea of the social resources model is certainly one we would want to promote from what we've learned so far.
Just to conclude, Brian, do you have a figure, although tentative, of the cost of, for instance, of a smart village, one example? Just to have an idea.
No.
No. So thank you.
Too risky.
Too risky. So thank you very much, everybody.